My doctor told me she knew people who had passed away and were healthier than me, and I thought I was in good health. Every year, my company paid me $200 to get a blood test. I was afraid I was going to get diagnosed with diabetes and have to stop eating dessert. Instead, everything came back fine, and I remember eating some candy with a friend to celebrate. The next year, they told me I had to see an actual doctor instead of a physician's assistant. No big deal. Or was it? Also, they wanted me to come back to the doctor's office that day. When I got there, the doctor told me I had Hashimoto's thyroiditis, a problem where the body's own immune system attacks itself until it no longer makes critical hormones needed to live. She told me about how a couple patients out of the blue went unconscious for missing this hormone and the doctors were not able to bring them back. She told me that they had healthier levels of this hormone than I did. My story is not so rare on a couple levels. At some point, about 12% of the general population will get the same disorder I did. Perhaps even more alarming is the way that about 15% of the population dies suddenly without any notice at all. Like the kind of end where it's so fast you can't plan on it. And those people taken by surprise might be the ones who are making great efforts in life so that their future self can enjoy something that sounds meaningful, and then not getting a chance to spend their savings vacationing in New Zealand or Japan, or like people who think they can make bad choices their entire lives and then ask God for forgiveness, only to find that their time ended here too suddenly for that. I thought I was doing okay, while I was just a step away from my final moments on this earth. The truth about my condition was hidden from me. Existentially speaking, there's a hidden side of truth to people, but it's hidden in a different way. Existential truth is the truth people hide from themselves. And existentially speaking, these people have already passed away. This has been my struggle, but it hasn't just been mine. It's been yours too. Everyone's, actually. I want to explore this with you in 3 ways. First, how I came to despise existential truth. I want to show you how I allowed the world to shape my thinking, how I became complicit in wearing its paper-thin masks to cover the decaying self I had underneath, and the superiority I thought I had found in its thinking and in its patterns. Second, how I changed my perspective. I want to show you a specific quote from Soren Kierkegaard that sounded like the most false thing I had ever heard. But then I began to see how false my perspective was and how true his words were. Make sure to stick around for the quote, because the way you see it says a lot about how you see existentialism. Third, how my life has gained from existential truth. I'd like to show you a few ways it has made a difference for the better. Nietzsche also has an observation about how this tendency plays out with a lot of people. Just like I thought I knew that my body was in good shape while I was steps away from my last breath, I thought I knew everything in high school. When I was in middle school, a mentor suggested I take a Christian apologetics class before going to high school. I thought if I didn't take this class, people were going to think I was stupid, that I had a small brain religion because I had a small brain. What could be better than getting other people to think that I was some kind of Jeopardy champion? What could be more true in life than having the answers on a game show? Just like on a game show, since everyone usually ends up agreeing on the answers, I thought the truth could be something objective we all agreed on. Surely life had its winners and its losers, and the people who understood these monolithic facts were not the champions of just a game show, but champions of life. I thought I could pour my life into this without the slightest sense that maybe the more I allowed trivia to steer my life, the more trivial my life was becoming. One of the things I heard in apologetics was how truth wasn't just this goopy thing that was whatever you wanted it to be. If it was, then people could just make being a deadbeat into the truth, or making crimes into the truth, or all kinds of bad into truth. I thought I had an appealing message for people to hear. I wanted to pitch my views as a platform to confront some of these epic problems going on in the world. I could sound smart and have something that sounded helpful at the same time. I didn't see how a storm was brewing in my life because I was begging it to be there. Let's look at how wide-ranging all this is. Imagine a sign saying, "Your choices do nothing to change the truth." This seemed patently obvious to me. People on Facebook still tell me this frequently. What could be false about it? If I choose to be a millionaire, it doesn't mean that I look in my checking account and all of a sudden a giant sum of money is waiting for me, does it? In other words, it seems like just because you can view certain things to be true doesn't make them true. That was the main problem I had with existentialism. But I'll add that it seemed like existentialism was a way to short-circuit the thought process. Surely there was a logical progression of truths that could finally describe everything. I thought that uncovering the truth was as simple as identifying the inconsistencies and reasoning through the questions of life. But life has a funny way of pushing against the clever ways we explain our time here. Fast forward a few years, and my plans seem to be coming together, and yet on another level, falling apart. My mentor who had paid for me to go to the apologetics classes was going through two crises in his life, relational and financial. He found himself at the end of his rope. He called me while I was overseas studying philosophy at Oxford University. His reasoning was that since I had done all of this logical searching for the truth, that surely I had some guidance for him. At that time, I was studying what philosophers had said about whether our descriptive ideas, also called universals, exist outside the human mind, and I couldn't see how that subject could even begin to address the problems my friend was going through. The sad irony was that philosophy presents itself like it can explain the meaning of everything, but it can't even explain its own meaning. I wish that somehow it would give me an ability to speak into my friend's life, but it did not. The person I had entrusted as my mentor was under great hardship, and a week later decided to leave this life behind. I felt like Plato and Aristotle were powerless to walk me through all of that, but I began to reflect on some words I had heard from when I was a child. Jesus made a distinction between two kinds of truth: the kind that you can build your house on your entire life and it stands, and the kind where when you build on it, the storms come and your life crashes. Unlike a philosopher who focuses on ideas, which are out in the ethereum up beyond the moon, Jesus said we should look down at the foundation we are building on, claiming it was an existing person, himself. I began to understand something I had heard Jesus say before in a new way. That anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey it is foolish, like a person who builds a house on sand. When the rains and floods came and the winds beat against the house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. In some ways, I think of Jesus as a forerunner to a lot of existential writers in the 20th century who considered whether or not to go on living to be the only significant question of philosophy. Existentialism is an anti-philosophy philosophy. Kierkegaard's arguments against the philosophers is often compared to an accusation of handing out recipe books to starving people. A starving person might not understand how to make food, but this is usually not why or how people end up starving. Kierkegaard made the observation, what the philosophers say about reality is often as deceptive as when you see a sign in a second-hand store that reads, "Pressing done here." If you went in with your clothes to have them pressed, you would be fooled. The sign is for sale. To me, the sign in the parable reminds me a lot of ideas. Just because there is an idea about something doesn't mean it exists. The struggles that the people close to me were going through came much closer, and they came into my life. Around that time, I found myself getting my appendix removed. If I had been a child at the time, I would have trusted my doctors and found something to enjoy about my time at the hospital. But I denied this to myself. Instead, walking through the reasons and logic that led me to the views I had. Hours before the surgery, the anesthesiologist came into my room and asked me to sign some papers. He said it was just a typical release statement, but he had a colorful way of putting it. He told me that sometimes zebras run over people, and that's how some people reach their end. He explained that, as tragic as that is, it almost never happens. People were just legally required to account for it. After that, I felt unprepared to face what could be my final moments. As much as my brain tried to assure my spirit that the odds of getting coded on the operating room table were microscopically small, my spirit could not follow my brain. I felt a lot of tension over it. And this reminds me of something I read Blaise Pascal, a proto-existentialist, write in his book of sayings. The knowledge of outward things will not console me in times of affliction. It turned out that I had survived the surgery, and rather than learn from the experience, I decided it would conflict with my interest in philosophy, logic, and apologetics. So I tried my best to forget it ever happened. There were also two Christian thinkers who I was struggling with. The first one was a writer named Lee Strobel, who wrote a book called The Case for Christ. The book is about a skeptic who interviewed a number of people and decided to believe. One of the people Lee interviewed was a person who quoted Jesus as saying, "You believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." I thought to myself, Jesus seems to think it's better to believe without having reasons and evidence. Since I thought of myself as a Christian, it seemed bizarre to me that I wasn't believing in a simple way, like a child. I felt like I was going against something Jesus specifically said to do. The second thinker I was struggling with was this guy named Francis Schaeffer, who wrote a book called The God Who Is There. His book brought up Kierkegaard several times in a critical way. Schaeffer insisted that it did not matter whether Kierkegaard was a devoted Christian or not, because that has nothing to do with the logical basis for Kierkegaard's views. In some kind of strange way, I actually think Kierkegaard would agree with that. Kierkegaard fearlessly criticizes logic for several reasons, which I'm not going to get into here. This had such an effect on me because I was thinking to myself, wait, was Kierkegaard devoted about his views? I checked a couple places, and sure enough, everyone seemed to think Kierkegaard was one of the most devout writers ever. My interest in philosophy and reason was starting to feel like a burden, like a major liability I was starting to carry around my neck. There was one more quote from Kierkegaard that I thought was the worst thing I had ever heard. So here's that quote I was mentioning earlier. Kierkegaard said, "Only in subjectivity is there decisiveness. To seek objectivity is to be in error." When I first read this quote, it seemed like the most false thing anyone could possibly ever say. Maybe he was saying this was a license to do the worst imaginable things, I thought. It was such a traumatic moment for me. I remember to this day the border store I read this quote in. Well, I did not want to think about this passage anymore, but I did. I thought about how subjectivity was maybe somehow like making the truth personal. And the more I tried to account for how Kierkegaard could write these terrible things, the more I could feel the gravity of Kierkegaard's statement about objectivity pulling me in. But can you change the world by changing your choices? Yes, on several levels. First, psychologists have observed this thing they call the Pygmalion effect, where people who don't want something or don't choose something never end up seeing it. Second, even though supernatural activity is often disputed, surveys have shown that privately, even most atheists think supernatural things happen. After dwelling on all of this for a while, I decided I couldn't truthfully say anything unless I had a personal connection to what I was saying. That an objective view is just the viewpoint of nobody. That there was no truth that would make up my mind for me. That's when I began to accept what people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Soren Kierkegaard had to say about life. Lastly, I want to share how existential truth has benefited me. The growing expectation people have of someone else coming into their lives and making their choices has led to staggering mental health problems, especially in recent US history. People aren't sure how to understand what anxiety is and how to avoid it. They're not sure what despair is and think maybe desperation is even a good thing. Having an existential perspective and living in the world of existing things does a lot to ground these kinds of fantastical thoughts. And if there's one thing that you can't fit into your head, it's the subject of love. I don't know if you've ever heard the expression, lucky in cards, unlucky in love. But I hear it as saying that the people who are able to calculate the most efficiently and shrewdly tend to be the last ones to understand love. Maybe the most prominent voice drawing attention to this tendency has been Nietzsche.
So what's his deal?
Friedrich Nietzsche is perhaps best remembered because he zinged the detached observations of philosophers so spectacularly. He extended this into the observation that philosophers don't fall in love. Nietzsche only allowed a couple of exceptions to this: Martin Luther, Socrates, and Descartes. Do any of these guys look like existential hero material to you? I find in my marriage that approaching our problems from an existential point of view helps identify who we are, how to pursue our goals, and how to have an authentic approach to finding them. There's something about how being honest with yourself can give you a fighting chance toward being honest with other people. I'll add that while existential living has yielded me a lot of understanding, nothing has shaped me as much as trusting in Jesus, as I remember that the day is coming when I will breathe my last. So to wrap up, just like I went to the doctors thinking I was in good health while actually having worse health than people who had already passed away, a lot of people think they have meaningful lives because of who they are on the surface or in their fantasies without actually being anyone at all. Existentialism has helped me move from valuing myself based on how good I was at thinking, or how much other people seemed to like me, or what I felt like on a given day. It reminds me that my choices say a lot about who I am, and to carefully examine my choices every day. How does existential living sound to you? Does it sound very different from how you are currently living? Does an existential approach resonate with you? Let me hear in the comments how you look at it. And don't forget to subscribe and click on that like button.